The trucks came before sunrise. 3 of them, tanks sloshing, backing down a dirt lane toward 4 abandoned rice conversion ponds, outside a town so small the post office only opened Tuesdays and Fridays. Nobody in that county had pulled anything worth eating out of that water in almost a decade. So when word got around that a young woman had asked a hatchery to fill those ponds with freshwater prawns, thousands of them, half the county found a reason to drive past and look. She stood at the bank in rubber boots that were 2 sizes too big, a clipboard tucked under one arm, and watched pale, thread-thin post-larvae pour into water that had been dead so long even the frogs had given up on it. One of the hatchery drivers, a heavy-set man who'd been hauling livestock for 20-some years, pulled her aside before he left. Told her straight these were culls, undersized juveniles from a batch that missed its size window for the export contract, not worth the diesel it took to haul them. She thanked him for the warning. Then she asked him when the next load was coming. Her name was Odessa Renault, and if you think the best opportunities are usually the ones somebody else already threw away, stick with this one. It's worth it. And if you're watching from somewhere far from any coast, somewhere nobody expects to find a fish farm, tell us in the comments. We like knowing how far this reaches. A year before any of this, Odessa didn't know a prawn from a crawdad. She'd grown up in a river town 3 counties over, raised largely by her Aunt Colette after her mother took a job overseas and never quite came back for her. Colette ran a small upholstery shop, the kind of business that survived on stubbornness more than profit, and she had a habit of pulling broken furniture out of estate sales for pennies, convinced that almost nothing was actually beyond saving if you had the patience to strip it down and start over. Colette died in the spring, and going through her modest estate, Odessa found a property deed she hadn't known existed, 11 acres with 4 levee ponds on it, built decades earlier for rice farming and later converted half-heartedly for catfish that never made it past a single failed season. Colette had bought the land for almost nothing at a bankruptcy auction, and then done exactly nothing with it for 20 years except pay the taxes. Folded inside the deed was a note in Colette's cramped handwriting, no explanation attached. Most things people call ruined are just things nobody's finished yet. Odessa didn't understand it. She'd turn it over in her mind for the next year without cracking it open, and it wouldn't make sense to her until the very end when she'd realize her aunt hadn't been writing about the land at all. At the time, she was working nights at a call center, splitting rent on an apartment she could barely afford, holding a deed to 4 algae-choked ponds that felt like exactly the kind of nothing her family tended to leave behind. A neighbor offered her $6,000 for the land, mostly for the road frontage. She nearly took it, but something about that note kept her hand off the pen, so she drove out instead, alone, to actually look at what she owned. It was worse than she expected: collapsed levees, a rusted paddle wheel aerator half sunk in the mud, water with a smell that reached the truck before she'd even parked. But 40 minutes away, there was an aquaculture extension office, and inside it a soft-spoken specialist named Desmond Elo, who'd spent half his career consulting on failed pond operations exactly like this one. She showed him photos on her phone and asked the question she felt foolish asking out loud: could this land ever be worth anything again? Desmond didn't laugh, but he didn't flatter her either. Rehabilitating even 2 of the 4 ponds would cost more than she had saved, he told her. Most people who tried this kind of turnaround quit within a year. If she wanted a return off that acreage, she'd get there faster planting soybeans and leasing the ground out. He mentioned the smallest, shallowest pond almost as an afterthought, said its bottom sediment tested unusually well, and that it might matter someday if she ever got that far. She barely registered the comment. Before she left, she asked one more question. If she somehow got the ponds working, where would she find stock cheap enough to start? That question is what led her, 3 weeks later, to a prawn hatchery 90 miles inland and roughly 9,000 juvenile freshwater prawns nobody else wanted. The reason was almost boring. The hatchery had overproduced a batch meant for an export processor's size-graded contract, and a mechanical mix-up let 2 size classes co-mingle in one holding tank, which meant none of it qualified as uniform stock. Biosecurity rules meant they couldn't just release the surplus into open water, and holding costs ate margin by the day. Normally this meant a disposal fee and a dead loss. When Odessa called asking to take the culls for free, the hatchery manager, a no-nonsense woman named Priscilla Doyle, was almost suspicious of the request, certain there had to be an angle. Nobody asked for off-grade stock, and nobody asked for more of it than was on offer. But Priscilla had been in the trade long enough to know mixed-size prawns weren't worthless. Just unsellable as a single-graded product. If Odessa wanted to sort and grow them out herself on her own dime, that was Odessa's gamble, not the hatcheries. Priscilla agreed, mostly because it solved her own disposal problem and because she privately gave the ponds 6 months before they failed anyway. That deal is what put 3 unmarked trucks on that gravel lane and a line of skeptical neighbors along the fence line, waiting to watch a stranger's plan fall apart. The first weeks nearly proved them right. She didn't yet understand that freshwater prawns are ruthlessly territorial and cannibalistic when crowded. Those small, empty-looking ponds could only hold so many bodies before the prawns began attacking their own molting kin, the soft-shelled ones defenseless for the few hours after shedding their exoskeletons. 10 days in, she found the shallow end of pond 2 littered with claws and half-eaten juveniles, nearly 1,500 lost overnight to nothing but overcrowding and her own ignorance of how much structure, PVC pipe, mesh, anything to break sightlines prawns actually needed to survive each other. Desmond, when she called him in a panic, didn't say he'd warned her. He walked her through building cheap vertical habitat out of shade cloth and scrap piping, giving the molting prawns somewhere to hide from their neighbors during the only hours they were vulnerable. It cost her almost nothing but labor, and it stopped bleeding. Then came the drought. Weeks without rain dropped pond levels low enough to spike water temperature past what the prawns could tolerate, and she lost a second wave before she learned to monitor afternoon highs and run backup well water through at dusk to cool things down before the worst of the overnight stress hit. Then came the herons and the raccoons, worse than the herons, working the shallow banks at night with a patience she hadn't credited them with until she strung low electric wire around the waterline, an ugly, unglamorous fix that worked better than anything expensive would have. And just when she thought the worst was behind her, a problem arrived that had nothing to do with water at all. A regional feed shortage, driven by a shipping disruption 2 states away, spiked her feed costs almost overnight, the single largest recurring expense in her operation jumping without warning. She considered stretching the feed thin to survive the season, a shortcut Desmond talked her out of immediately. Prawns starved at the wrong growth stage didn't just grow slower, they molted poorly and died in the shell, and any savings vanished twice over in losses. Instead, she locked in a season-long contract with a smaller regional mill, trading flexibility for a price she could actually plan around. Every failure taught her something the last one hadn't. She learned to check dissolved oxygen before dawn, the hour it always ran lowest. She learned that prawns hiding motionless at the pond edges in daylight meant something was wrong long before any of them started dying visibly. She learned to stagger stocking so she wasn't harvesting one massive uneven batch, but a rolling supply she could actually manage size by size. Her first sale happened almost by accident. A neighbor who'd spent the whole summer smirking from his porch asked, half joking, if she had anything worth cooking yet. She sold him a cooler of prawns for cash, and within a week he'd told 2 friends at the diner in town. The real turn came when a chef named Booker Sinclair, who ran a modest Cajun-influenced kitchen 40 minutes away, drove out after a produce distributor mentioned trying her prawns and being surprised by the size and sweetness. Booker didn't want a favor. He wanted the same size, same quality, every single week. That single demand forced the hardest lesson of her first-year grading. Because she'd started with mismatched off-size stock, her ponds grew prawns unevenly, some hitting market size fast, others lagging for weeks. Restaurants wouldn't tolerate 3 different sizes in one delivery box. She had to learn to net and sort by size at every stage, moving slow growers into their own section of pond to catch up. Realizing grading wasn't a sorting chore, but an entire way of managing every pond differently, depending on what stage of life it was holding. She failed Booker's order twice before getting it right. He nearly walked the second time. She drove out in person, admitted the mistake with no excuses, and asked for one more chance with a smaller order she could guarantee. He gave it to her. It became a standing account. Growth came the slow, unglamorous way growth actually comes. Farmers market regulars turned into 2 more restaurant accounts. One wanted live delivery before sunrise. which meant learning to purge and pack prawns in aerated coolers overnight without losing half of them to stress by morning. Her first delivery vehicle, an old pickup with a single cooler strapped in the bed, cost her an entire order to heat before she understood ice-to-water ratios and airflow well enough to keep stock alive on a 90-minute drive. A seafood distributor eventually offered her a standing contract with volume requirements that terrified her more prawns than her 4 ponds could reliably deliver. That contract forced her hardest decision: stay small or expand. She took a loan she hated taking, rehabilitated the 4th pond, the one Desmond had mentioned almost in passing, the one with the good bottom soil, and hired her first employee, a former hatchery technician named Foster, who understood grading and disease far better than she did, and taught her the rest. Disease hit the following winter, a bacterial outbreak that threatened to sweep every pond before she and Foster caught it early, thanks to a habit she'd built without noticing. Walking the banks every single morning, watching for prawns behaving even slightly wrong. She survived it with losses instead of collapse, because by then she'd learned to see trouble before it became a disaster. By her 2nd year, Odessa had added a small purge tank system and an on-site cooking and freezing setup that let her sell peeled, ready-to-cook prawns to specialty grocers at nearly double the margin of live sales. She crossed 6 figures in revenue, not from one dramatic sale, but from the slow accumulation of accounts. Nobody would have predicted the morning 3 trucks first back down that gravel lane. Priscilla Doyle, the hatchery manager who'd once been suspicious of her, became one of her steadiest suppliers, sending Odessa the same off-grade mixed-size stock other buyers rejected, because Odessa was the only person in 3 counties who knew what to actually do with it. Late one evening, walking the bank of the same pond where she'd lost those first 1,500 juveniles, Odessa finally understood her aunt's note. Colette hadn't meant the land at all. She'd meant her all the years Odessa had assumed she was just another loose end in a family that specialized in leaving things unfinished. Colette had seen something in her long before Odessa ever saw it in herself. The ponds were never the inheritance. The willingness to sit with something everyone else had already given up on, that was what her aunt had actually left her. The trucks still come sometimes now, hauling stock other buyers won't touch. Odessa still walks the banks before sunrise, watching the water the way her aunt once studied a broken chair before deciding it wasn't broken at all, just unfinished. Nobody laughs anymore when a truck turns down her lane. They just watch, same as always, except now they're waiting to see what she'll build next.